Start as well, I want to say a big thank you to the MayDayRooms. And they have enabled us to come here today. They've let us use this lovely venue. They've been involved in anarchist politics from the 60s, kind of publishing, creating resources, and you can use this space for free as well for any sort of discussions, and you can put that. It's really worth getting in touch with them. You can use the website. And also donations are welcome. But thank you very much to Georgia. It's been really great having you assist us with the logistics of today. So, Steve.
Hello everybody, thank you so much for coming. It's good to see you all here. Okay, I must remember that I stand on these spots so that the camera is picking me up.
That's your position, aren't it?
No, these are my marks. I've got to stay here, so it's just to remind me I can't nail my feet to the floor, but it's the nearest thing. So I want to start off by talking about our positionality, and really that is who we are, and how we came here, our journey in life, and how we reached the point where we're talking about this subject. So to introduce myself, I'm Steve. I am a senior lecturer at York St John University. I'm deaf, and I have been since the age of 4 as a result of meningitis. And I have a mental health diagnosis, so I consider myself to be disabled. So I have experienced a lot of access barriers in my life. I'm from a working class background. I started working in a printer after I finished school, and I was involved in radical politics from that time, really. This is my union, the NGA, that I was involved in at the time, the National Graphical Association. I was also involved in other elements of the political left. That's why I've got the picture of the red flag up there. You can see the photograph there, the police with the shields. This is actually the poll tax riots. I was involved with lots of those demonstrations on the radical left at the time, opposing the poll tax, opposing apartheid. I was also involved in supporting the miners' strikes, the printers' strikes, so I was very active around that time in the 1980s. My politics shifted after that time, and I left the left organisation I was in, and I turned more towards the deaf community, campaigning for deaf rights, recognition of BSL and so forth. There was a lot of direct action and street protest involved in that too. I was still very much supportive of my union, which I was involved in, and of radical left politics in tandem with that. But my political views shifted from a kind of party form, which I felt then was unnecessary, and I moved more towards anarchist politics, which has continued to draw me in. But I think I'm still learning. I wouldn't consider myself to be a full bona fide anarchist, but I'm an activist who's very interested in anarchism. There are lots of barriers that I've come across, but at the same time I do have privileges that I have to recognise as part of my identity. Here's a photograph of me doing my PhD. Yes, I'm working class, but I've been able to study a PhD. I'm also a white man, I'm cisgendered. So I recognise the privileges that I have on those aspects of my identity. And I want to explain that because people, yes, we can acknowledge that people who are deaf and have mental health diagnosis experience barriers, but I have a privilege due to other aspects of my personality as well. Thank you back to you.
Great, so I'm Darwin. This is my sign name of my neck. My politics are different from Steve. I've not been so much involved in street brawls and things like that. I grew up in a middle class background. My parents were both doctors working within the NHS. I have worked in the NHS myself as well. So I came from more of a politically centrist background and have kind of found socialism more along the way. I went to university and started to mix with people like him. Bad influence. But yeah, so that was the point at university where I started to learn a little bit more, kind of in those ways. But Steve had set up kind of some deaf workshops in sign language around 2011 there, and I went to some of those. So that's the first time I saw some more anarchist politics and was like, wow, some deaf people involved in this as well. and that's just kind of a seed that's grown and developed throughout the years. So yeah, it's been a number of years. And again, as Steve says, I have a number of privileges. I'm male, I'm white, I'm cisgendered. But again, I have barriers as well. One thing I want to recognise is that I have English privilege, which means I've got a really good level of literacy. I can speak, but I choose not to, because I think people believe often when you speak to them that you can hear them as well and you can read them perfectly, which is not the case. So I made a decision to use sign language. But as someone with English provision with good literacy, I can access complex texts because I've had a good education in English, which is not the case for all deaf people. So I was involved in UC strikes, so that's how I've kind of been a union member as well. But I think one thing is I've been more involved in political campaigning more on kind of large organisation level, because they tend to have access budgets, whereas kind of frontline grassroots political organisation doesn't tend to have the budget to provide access. Oh, sorry, that's just a photo that's got the word English privilege that I found online. That's what came up, so I just thought it was funny. But yes, that's an introduction to myself and Steve. So, we're going to be talking about radical politics involving disabled people. And radical politics doesn't necessarily mean right. You can have left radical politics as well, and I'll sign it to the left. I'm aware that people have awareness of some people involved in politics, but it's often not recognised that these are disabled people as well, and disabled people aren't always recognised for their radical politics. So this was Antonio Gramsci, sorry, and he's an Italian person, socialist, communist. Growing up,
he grew to be 5 foot tall. He contracted TB when he was younger, and he walked with a hunchback.
And he had a number of other disabilities and illnesses throughout his life. But people don't tend to talk about his disability and the context that gives when they discuss his political works. On the right-hand side, the woman in white at the bottom. That's
Rosa Luxemburg.
Rosa Luxemburg, thank you. So she's very well known as a communist theorist, and she was disabled as well. She had a problem with her hip from the age of 5, so she walked with a limp throughout her life. But that's never talked about in any sort of context around her political leanings. Che Guevara had asthma, seriously severe asthma, and during a lot of uprisings he was bedbound, and a lot of people don't realise that during a lot of revolutionary periods. So there's a lot of action and political action and people involved in this who have their disabilities ignored and the context that provides. Sometimes actually the opposite happens. So the woman on the top right hand side, that's Helen Keller, who's well known as a famous deafblind woman. And a lot of people are very aware of her name, but aren't aware of her political involvement. She was involved in international works of the world, the IWW. She was a strong left union advocate, and throughout her life was committed to the cause. And most people don't know that. A lot of people are like, oh wow, she's an amazing deafblind person, but don't realise the political work that she did. And a lot of, it's strange that you get both sides of that coin, where either someone's disabled identities erased, or people with a strong disabled identity have their political leanings erased. So I think it's important to think about why we have a lot of disabled people involved in politics. A lot of people see, a lot of people can view this through a lens of people advocating for their own rights and just on a kind of selfish point of view, wanting everything taken care of for themselves. but actually people who have experienced barriers, who've experienced oppression, want to kind of remedy these situations and are driven to campaign for it throughout their life. That people fight for equality, and it's a natural human thing to do, and that's often what radical left politics stems from. And disabled people are often seen as a vulnerable group and are kind of marginalised and often criticised and attacked by governments and other parts of society. But I think it's through that pressure, through that oppression, that you do start to get fights for equality, fights for equal rights, and it's no wonder as a result of that that disabled people become more radicalised. And another thing I wanted to show you was this gentleman. He's Italian. He's Ernesto Martesta. So this part of the quote here, I'll sign that as well. So he says, the lame, the weak, and the aged should be supported by society because it's the duty of humanity that no one should suffer. And it's a really beautiful quote, I feel. And I think that's one of the things that really shows that deaf and disabled people should be involved in these conversations. I mean, there are a whole host of other reasons to support this, but this second part, let's just make sure I'm on camera. So we too will grow old, could become weak or crippled, just as those dearest to us might. It's saying that, you know, everyone should have these rights, and even if you're able-bodied, you should be supporting them because you're not going to be able-bodied forever. So, for examples, we have 3 disabled people and one this is to be a deaf blind person. You don't see the kind of
BSL signing deaf people who are involved in radical politics historically. Yeah.
Sorry. So yeah, we've got one example of someone with strong deaf identity who was involved in radical politics.
So this is the person we're here to talk about, Leonard Motler. And we've given him a sign name, which is this, which means laughing. Because a lot of his writing has this undercurrent of humour through it, which we'll cover. He was a mixture of a socialist and an anarchist. Those were his main threads and tendencies. He started working and being active around the early 1900s, about 1910. He published 2 newspapers, or his work was published in 2 newspapers. One was called Clarion. That's really a socialist publication, more traditionally. And the other one was Freedom Press, which does have a mixture of ideas. They support workers' struggles. Well, in Clarion he wrote about workers' struggles, but also through Freedom Press, more ostensibly anarcho-communist ideas that he expressed through those writings. He talks about the abolition of property, and this is prior to World War I, so just to give you an idea of the time period. It's very clear from reading his works. From when the First World War started, he became very staunchly anarchist, or anarchist communist specifically. So this is a sketch that we believe is Leonard Motler, because it's a self-portrait, self-sketch. And this was from Freedom Press, I believe, This is actually from Satire magazine. We'll tell you more about Satire magazine later. So he was born... Sorry, before I go into that, it's so rare to find a deaf person in the left radical movement in this time period. You know, as Di said, we talked about Helen Keller. There are some people who you might be familiar with. There's also another person called George Skates. So he worked with Motler, and we will expand on that later. But really, Motler is an extremely rare character. You know, he's somewhat of a unicorn in a historical sense. In this time period, it's just not something you see. So that's why we were very keen to research more and find out what we could about Leonard. You know, we will talk about his deafness, but we want to talk about his contribution to radical politics as well. So there are really two elements of what we're going to be discussing. So, first of all, who was he? He was born in Eccles in 1888, and then he passed away actually in South Africa, in Johannesburg, in 1967. So he moved there from 1921. He moved to South Africa in 1921, and he actually came back to England, but then he was back and forth and eventually settled there until the end of his life. Please, if anything's not clear, please do interrupt. This is the timeline I'm just trying to give you an idea of. So he became deaf. He was actually walking past a shop. You know, the kind of coverings, awnings that they have outside the shop, and it hit him in the head, it fell down, he had an accident and became deaf from that accident. And how old was he? He was 5 at the time, so means really from birth till the age of 5 he would have been speaking, he would have been picking up language from his family. He would have developed some language, of course, by the age of 5, and then through that accident become deaf, and everything changes then, of course. He started to become a visual person and look at what was going on visually, as people who are deaf and do. So, yes, he grew up to the age of 5 using speech, and then suddenly was deaf through this accident, and it changed everything for him. So when I talk about being a visual person, we don't necessarily focus on the hearing loss, we talk about being a visual person, right? And we call that deaf game in the deaf community, we will elaborate on that later. So at that time, thinking about when it was, there was no hearing aids, there was no technology to support him, you know, like today. You went deaf when you were 5, I was 4, so, I mean, even at that time, this was in the 60s, and Di, it was the 80s for you, so about 1986, so different times. But we had hearing aids, and we tried to develop speech, of course, with these headphones and all these kind of devices, with a kind of oralist approach. But now, cochlear implants exist, and cochlear implants are implanted very early, but if you think about, you know, in the early 1900s, or even the late 1800s rather, there wasn't anything like that. So if we're thinking about around the 1900s, most people would be moved into a deaf school. That was the normal process. And now if you become deaf, you would have a cochlear implant and you would be mainstreamed. That's really how the education system mostly works now. At that time, you'd be placed in a deaf school. So you can mix with your deaf peers and communicate with them and learn how to do that. So that was Leonard's experience, that was Motler's experience. So he went to Boston Spa School from the age of 10. Is that right, Di? From the age of 10. Boston Spa, yeah. So 10 to 16 he was placed at Boston Spa, mixing with deaf peers. I'm going to hand over back to Di, but before I do, Motler really called himself the deaf mute. And you pick that up from his writing, he refers to himself as deaf mute. So that means he wasn't a speech user, we can infer that. And that's an interesting part of his identity, of his self-identity, of how he viewed himself.
So yeah, he describes himself as having lost his hearing and speech from the age of 5. So often when you lose your hearing, some people would continue to talk, but he didn't.
So So that means that he was really, you wonder how he was involved in the political movements of the time, with hearing people, and so we've looked into that.
Yeah. So I wanted to explain a little bit of the context of deaf life in the 1800s, late 1800s. So deaf education. So this is a report from the Royal Commission on educating the blind, the deaf and dumb, etc. And this was published in 1889. And this is espousing a theory called oralism. And oralism is the idea of educating deaf people without any sign language, making sure that education focuses on speech, and that came. This was kind of the popular approach at the time, and became popular at the time, and it changed the way deaf children were educated, and it also meant that deaf people weren't allowed to be teachers, and you couldn't get education from deaf adults. So sign language became less fashionable, and for a whole bunch of reasons that I don't want to go into particularly now, but that's the context of the changing educational environment, and deaf people, the attitudes towards deaf people as well changed, and deaf people who use sign language weren't as tolerated following this development. So just a little bit about Eccles at the time. So you can see here his house is just there, and that's number 52 on Church Street. So it was above tobacconists, and so his father worked in the mills, not far from there. And Eccles at that time was very strongly working class. It was a very strong union base. There were about 4 or so mills in the area. There was a lot of industry, a lot of workers around there. And at that time, a lot of people became deaf because of working in heavy industry. In a really noisy mill, you can't speak to people, even if you haven't been deafened, it's just too noisy. So there's a lot of gestural communication. And because of that, you get enhanced lip patterns and exaggerated lip patterns. So people living and working in Eccles would have been more used to communicating without sound and being more comfortable communicating gesturally. So at that time, maybe it wasn't so much of a barrier. Visual communication was much more the norm within the human community, or in that human community. So his father was kind of involved in industry, and potentially could also have some industrial deafness going on as well. So at home, we expect that there wasn't massive barriers with family communication. So as we said, Motler went deaf at the age of 5, but didn't go to school, a deaf school, until 10. So he had 5 years at home. We don't really know exactly what that involved, but we hope that it was happy with successful communication with the family. He said that for 5 years, and that his English developed very well, and he continues to develop his English, and he's got a really good grasp of English. So we assume that there's no issues with him continuing to be educated at home throughout that time. So the photo here we have, and that's really near where he grew up in Eccles, and that's the Eccles Cross, just there. And a small group of, just behind the Eccles Cross, you can see a group of boys. And when that photo was taken, Motler would have been 14. And those kids looked like they could potentially be around 14, so who knows, he might have been one of those kids in that group. So his house was really not far from there as well. So that's the place he would have frequented every day. And the Eccles Cross is important because there was a lot of kind of political campaigning, a lot of strikes centering on that, a lot of public speaking centering on that kind of point of interest in the town. So there'd be a May Day march, and we know that started from the Eccles Cross and went to Salford in Manchester. So we know that it was a very politically active community, and growing up, he often would have been looking out into the street and wondering what was going on. So that's a potential route for his involvement into workers' politics. So at 5 he was deafened, and at 10 he went to school. This is where he went, St John's Catholic School for the Deaf. So deaf people know this as Boston Spa, because in Boston Spa. And it's interesting that Boston Spa, do you know where it is? It's really not far from York. So York to Eccles is a bit of a significant distance. And I mean, maybe it's because his family were Catholic. Yeah, that's quite possible. Or the Trafford School is really close to Eccles, but he didn't go there. That was a much closer deaf school. We don't know why he went there, but potentially, you're right, Martin, it could be because he was Catholic. We found a certificate of his baptism, so it could well be because his parents wanted him to go to a Catholic school for deaf children, and that was one of the few schools, Catholic schools for deaf children in the UK. And we know that school didn't follow the Oralist tradition. It educated in sign language, so and usually it's called Belgian Sign Language rather than British Sign Language. We're not going to go into that as well right now, but also they had deaf teachers at that school as well, and one famous deaf teacher known as Mr. Capri.
Is it Catherine? Yeah, it's Catherine.
Caprini, thank you. And he was a deaf instructor himself, and he would have acted as a role model for the use of sign language. It's really important as well to know that Boston Spa, or St John's Catholic School for Deaf, was strongly Catholic in its instruction, so that's something important to remember as we go forward. So, yeah, it was, so the important points, it was a sign language using deaf school, so Motler had access to sign language, and this is where he maybe decided he didn't want to use speech, he wanted to prefer using sign language, and also it was staunch Catholic. And at that time, life was becoming quite difficult for deaf people. So working in kind of hearing practice and workshop, you would have deaf people who struggled a little bit with communication. They might write back and forth, they might use some gesture. Sometimes you might get hearing people who would learn some finger spelling, but you wouldn't get many hearing people who communicated in sign language or had the ability to. So he would work within a hearing environment in the day, and at night he would socialise in deaf clubs and deaf environments. And it's quite interesting because all of those deaf clubs would not run by deaf people, but at the time they would be run by hearing missioners. And it's always men, always male hearing missioners. You get occasional examples of a deaf missioner, but by and large they were hearing people who could sign. And there were no interpreters at the time, just missioners. Also, deaf clubs were usually set up by missioners for, quote, the deaf and dumb. So that's, and the aim of them would be, oh, look at these poor deaf people who don't have access to the Word of God, we're going to deliver it to them. So there was a very strong undertone of that. And that was deaf people's whole life, through their school life and through their social lives outside of work. So the missioners had very strong control of deaf people's life and influence on them, and as a result, you didn't get any sort of bars in deaf clubs, which would be more common in other working men's clubs and things like that. The first example of a bar being allowed in a deaf club in the UK was in Coventry in the 60s, in 1960. So it was Leonard had very different views. He was did not like commissioners. He was much more radical. He strongly disliked them. He didn't like the influence of the church and how the control that they had over deaf communities. So we have a quote from him, and it's a bit hard to translate that, but this is talking about the priesthood and death. Yeah, the translation of that is a bit tricky into BSL, but it's showing that they have this undue influence over the deaf community. And this quote here, talking about missioners and saying that they take special care that the deaf seldom sample anything except the special menu served at missions for the good of their souls. So they were kept from anything that might be seen as less than pure. They were strongly controlled and controlled by hearing missioners. And that was written in 1920. So you'll see why Motler is a bit of a unicorn. You don't tend to see that sort of politicalism. And he starts getting involved in radical politics, criticising the missioners. The missioners saw him as a naughty boy. And I use that word naughty boy particularly with intent because it was a very infantilising attitude that you'd get from these hearing missioners. And you really couldn't escape missioners as a deaf person at that time. They controlled deaf clubs. They were the people who acted as interpreters. If you needed to interact with any sort of official systems, it would be missioners who came in to do translation. So you couldn't escape them. I know, of course, missioners were priests at the time, so they were the people who were baptizing, doing weddings, marriages, deaths, birth to grave. You know, from those official ceremonies through the schooling system, into deaf clubs, to your funeral, you could not escape them. And we feel that Motler might have tried to get radical politics into deaf clubs and would have been swiftly shown the exit. It's a really early example of a deaf person who was much more
rejected the missioners and the religious influence in the deaf clubs.
So I'm sure there were other deaf people who held similar views, but he is someone who was written about, and he's someone we have actual records of, kind of that rebelling against the missionary, and that involvement in politics as well. So how Motler became a radical, we can't say for sure. We've mentioned the ethical cross and that being a centre of protest in the community. So possibly from a very young age he saw the union activity in Central Eccles. At Boston Star School in 1906 when he was 16. He moved from there to Manchester. And in Manchester he was involved in Esperanto. I don't know if people are aware of Esperanto, so it's an artificial language, human-made language, and he was involved in a lot of translation with Esperanto, and there was a large movement encouraging its use. So he was involved in the Esperanto Society, and until 1911, in that 1911 census, we know that he was still living in the Manchester area, and he was in a house with three other working men, and they
were machinists and those kinds of things,
working
engineers.
So Motler himself was a printer, and we knew he worked at a printer following his tuition at Boston Bar Deaf School in printing. So 1911 till 1914, at that time around the UK, was known as the time of great labour unrest. There were a lot of strikes, people were rebelling in the workplace, people were marching, because also at the time, we know in the Manchester area, around 1911, there was a lot of kind of upheaval because from reading we know that there was a lot of discussion, a lot of political organisation, and Motler was involved in printed union strike in January 1911 till April. So in 1911 we know that there was a lot of involvement in that kind of political action. So that could be where his passing to radical politics was, but we can't say for certain. So, Steve? What we can't say for certain. So, Steve? Oh, sorry, so that's a little bit of background, kind of his childhood, his movement into that community, his movement into radical politics.
So we've covered some of his life story, but I now want to discuss some of his politics, specifically his anarcho-communist politics. So I'm going to cover 3 parts, really, 3 elements. So his general activism, including a court case that he was involved in. Around the time of the Russian Revolution in 1917, I will talk about Motler's critique of that revolution. Remember, he was a revolutionary himself, so he had a critique from that perspective that I will discuss. And his move to South Africa is the 3rd element that I'll be discussing in this section. So firstly, for whatever reason, Motler was an anarchist communist, and this was around the outbreak of the First World War that he shifted to that political tendency in 1914. And at that time, the anarchist movement was split on whether it supported the war. Now, most anarchists did not support the war, most rejected, but there was a minority within the movement, so there was a split of some anarchists that did ostensibly support the First World War. There was a man called Peter Kropotkin, who was an anarchist. He actually set up Freedom Press magazine himself. We know that Motler was a strong critic, and he completely rejected the involvement in the First World War. And around just before the First World War broke out, he was writing for this socialist publication and also for Freedom Press as well. Once the war started, he was no longer involved in the socialist publication. He completely focused his time on Freedom Press, and as his politics moved in that direction, he was writing articles for Freedom Press. He also worked as a printer with Freedom Press, so he wrote and contributed. So this was after the war broke out. He was working as a printer, and you said this before, he was very skilled in Esperanto and involved in that at the time, and Freedom Press did actually have some Esperanto translations from Spanish contributors, Chinese contributors. They translated those into Esperanto and into English. So there were various languages being used in the press. There were many publications he was involved in Freedom Press, but through that he was introduced to Sylvia Pankhurst. That's one of the people he came across. When I say introduced, Sylvia Pankhurst actually had commented on Leonard Motler's work, so we know they came across each other, and they talked about his humour. Now, when Motler worked in the printing press at Freedom Press, he was also working with another person, Silvio Corio, yeah, just to make sure I got that right. And he was Italian, he was also an anarchist. They worked together on the printing as well, at Freedom Press again. It's not free, sorry, that sign means it's free of charge, it's a different context. Now, Sylvia Pankhurst was also around. She met Corio, And we believe that they met through Motler. So there was that mixed milieu, that anarchist kind of radical society at the time, and people were all coming into contact with each other and with Motler. There's so many of his articles and publications, but here there's a few up on the PowerPoint. He was a prolific writer. He wrote for all these different publications and many more. We've already mentioned Clarion. There's Workers' Dreadnought, which was previously called Women's Dreadnought and then became Workers' Dreadnought. Voice of Labour, Labour's Voice, and of course Freedom Press. So there are a huge number of his writings across a broad range of subjects, really. He then started his own publication, Satire, which we can see here. And that's with another person called George Skates. And he was also a deaf man. And we don't know much about George Skates, but they did work together, that we do know.
So we know that they both went to Boston Fast School. George Skates was 2 years below Motler, and he was from London. So we expect that they met at Boston Spa and kind of went from there, but we can't say for certain. And also they started this publication, they started as an editor, and George Skates was the manager of the publication. So Motler was an editor, but there was a very strong anarchist undertone and politics in that publication.
So that means from 1916 to 1918, through the time of the First World War, his ideas were mainly around opposing the war, arguing for revolution as well, agitating, and sort of espousing those radical ideas throughout the First World War as it went on. And there are 3 examples of his, well, where he got in trouble really. So, involved with the police, the courts, he was persecuted by them, and I have 3 examples of those. So he was arrested for selling 4 lottery tickets. He was fundraising for Satire magazine, and he sold these lottery tickets. He went to court over that. The court were very suspicious that you're raising the money. He was raising the money for himself, that it was fraudulent. He explained it was for campaigning purposes. He was arrested. So the court fined him £25. Now, £25 doesn't sound like much, but it's about 1,500 equivalent, accounting for inflation. But comrades that he was working with contributed, and they paid off the fine. But there's an interesting point actually, Guy, that you were talking about Reverend Gilby, the missioner. Reverend Gilby was an interpreter in the court. So Guy was mentioning that the missioners were the interpreters. Well, Reverend Gilby was the interpreter in the court. So he had to translate what was being said into sign language and back. But Motler decided not to rely on Reverend Gilby. He decided to write his responses down. He had no trust in Gilby because of his previous experiences with missioners, and decided he did not want to rely on him as an interpreter in the court. George Skates, the co-contributor, was also arrested by the police. During wartime, there was an expectation of having the lights off at a certain time, and he didn't comply with that, so the police came knocking on George Skates' house. He went to school, he went to court, and he was fined £1. I mean, less than Motler's, but at that time it was about £90, not insignificant. So they were being targeted. So the Satire magazine, this is the second example. It was published from 1916. Really, they'd set up magazines. They'd set it up because Voice of Labour they were previously working on had been shut down. They carried on with publicising satire, publishing satire, and then they were raided actually by the police at that time. Satire was raided. Sorry. Voice of Labour was shut down by the police. Sorry, they were raided, and he was working there. It wasn't satire. It was raided. Yeah. So that's when they focused on satire and carried on from there because Voice of Labour was shut down. The police then actually raided satire later. They took the printing materials, they took their money. This was actually raised in Parliament at the time in 1918. There was an MP called Lee Smith who had raised this in Parliament and said, why has this happened? They confiscated all of the equipment, and Lee.
So Lee was asking in Parliament whether the materials could be given back.
Yes. In the third example, they were fined. They were trying to organise in a workplace in a more traditional sense, and he was fired because he was trying to organise in the workplace. So he was writing, he was printing, he was doing a lot of radical activities and being very proactive as a workplace organiser, and therefore he was, targeted by his workplace and also by the state. So that's his activism. It's good to know also that Motler was one of the first people to be critical of what was developing in Russia in the post-revolution era. So this is 1917, of course. There were lots of supporters around the world on the left, from communists, socialists, and broadly the left. There was a lot of support for the Russian Revolution at that time. At that time, Russia was using workers' control groups, Soviets, which was a radical policies that were being introduced in the post-revolution phase. These were workers' councils. As I mentioned, they're called Soviets. So the land was owned by who lived there, right? The land was given back to the population that lived there and who worked there. They also introduced the 8-hour day. There were improvements to women's rights and equality. I believe it was the first time in the world that Russia did have some radical policies that were supported and approved of by a lot of people on the left. And a lot of anarchists partly supported it too, but Motler. So obviously the revolution was in October 1917. And Motler was critical. At the time when lots of anarchists and people on the left, socialists, were not critical, he was one of the first people to be more of an outspoken critic. So you can see here. This was published in December 1917. He's saying that he was unsure about how the revolution was progressing and he was critical of it. People are beginning to feel powerful. They're giving away their self-control to other groups, workers' self-control. And he means the likes of Lenin and the party, that people were giving up their direct workers' control and their autonomy to the party system, which he was critical of. And he could see that it looks like it's becoming more like a capitalist system. And he was saying this in 1917. Now, anarchists and anarcho-communists started to discuss about these issues later on and start to consider that it was becoming a totalitarian state. But he was much, much earlier in making his critiques than many others within the movement. This is clarifying the meaning of authoritarian, so it means that the Russian state becoming authoritarian, oppressive. So he saw this early on. So what was interesting is that lots of his comrades at the time were very supportive, and he was an outlier because people were saying, yes, people have workers' control, this is great. And Motler was saying, no, I'm not so sure there is, and he was critical. So this is his view before it was adopted across a section of the left, really, in the British anarchist movement of the time. He still believed in the ultimate goal of a communist society. But I suppose, to summarise, sorry, can we just put the next slide on that? He mixed with many different radicals, working, as I said, for Freedom Press. I've talked about the lottery tickets arrest, so these are kind of significant moments of his life. When he had the legal court case related to that, he decided not to use Reverend Gilby in the court case because he wanted to advocate for himself in written English. We've discussed the premises being raided. Again, he was one of the first British anarchists to express concerns about the direction of the Russian Revolution. So really, it's astounding that a deaf person at that time, bearing in mind that he was being oppressed on the basis of using sign language, that he was espousing these revolutionary ideas that weren't popular, and he was still so determined to make that happen and to, So in 1921, as I mentioned before, he moved to South Africa. We don't know much about that, but he wrote letters to the editors of Freedom Press, and in a letter he said he was worried about the political climate, but he doesn't really go into much detail in his letters. But at that time, it was the 1920s, there was a lot of oppression. The Dora Defence of the Realm was being used to repress a lot of activists at the time, like Sylvia Pankhurst. So this is here in the UK. She was arrested and imprisoned for 6 months. I think this was in October in 1920. There were other activists at the time that were also being targeted by the state and severely repressed. So I think Motler was very concerned about this and his own safety, and this inspired his relocation to South Africa ultimately. So he went by boat, and when he arrived, obviously he was deaf. He actually wasn't allowed in. So he was trying to persuade the authorities there to get in upon arrival, and he was ultimately successful at being allowed into the state. He was able to use contacts that he had on the radical left through his sister, and he was able to kind of leverage that to actually get into South Africa in the end. He continued to work on his writing and expand on his ideas around anarchist communism. And he carried on writing for Workers' Dreadnought. And he commented on South African politics as well. This is around 1923, we have records of that. So around 1923 to 25, he came back to the UK to try and establish an organisation for people involved in radical politics who wanted to effect change without involving themselves in parliamentary politics. So setting up different grassroots groups and trying to encourage radicals to get involved and set a federation of like-minded people, but it wasn't successful. So from 1925, we don't know about his politics after that point, and that's probably another project in and of itself.
So Motler is just an absolutely fascinating person. There's still a lot that we don't know about him. For example, as you say, his time in South Africa, mostly we don't know what happened there. There's more to research there. We don't know how he got involved in radical politics in the first place, but from that period, 1911 to 14, he was incredibly active, and we can see some things that happened. And a lot of the unrest at that time, the cost of living was going up, living standards were going down. It seems strangely familiar, can't say why. But we see this involvement in politics that we don't know where that exactly came from. We do have a lot of gaps in kind of his rationale behind kind of his movements from between different periods. But it's really interesting to see someone like this who is someone who's advocating for himself, who's a sign language user, he's involved in mainstream politics, and it's just absolutely fascinating. And this person is not talked about within deaf communities at all. So yeah, we're trying to find out as much more as we can about him. So we think that Motler is a really, really important figure. We've found out, we found some of his
mention of him in anarchist
literature, but it doesn't mention that he's deaf. It's all about his politics, but there's no mention of his deafness or his membership of deaf communities. And in deaf communities, we just don't have him in our history. He's not talked about. He's kind of been lost. He's invisible. And I think we need to get him back into these famous deaf people we talk about, historical role models. I think it's really important to kind of show him, because Motler was involved in radical politics. He was an organiser, and it's really important to show that deaf people can do this. There's a lot of kind of deaf art throughout history, but actually he's a really fascinating person to show that actually deaf people can be involved in mainstream politics. And just thinking of him as a writer, as a poet, as a political activist, as a revolutionary, it's just absolutely fascinating the achievements of the person.
And he wrote lots of poetry actually, and some of them, he had a book published eventually. I think he won a prize even in South Africa later in his life. He won a prize for his poetry. And it's incredible.
So yeah, I mean, I can talk a lot more about him, but I wanted to end on kind of Motler himself and give him the last word. So a couple of examples I want to show you. So this is an anarchist communist publication. This is Anarchist Communism in Plain English. And I'm going to take a couple of quotes from this, and I'll translate them to sign language as well. So this is the publication, this is the front page of it. Anarchism means no rules. That is to say, mind your own business. And when the people start doing that, and minding their own business, they have no use for tyrants, big and little, plain and coloured. Communism means working together for the good of all. Consequently, people will be prepared to accept the ex-capitalists as fellow workers, provided they do useful work. And by working together in staunch cooperations, people will be less in danger of any tyrant resurrecting himself and his friends and going back to the good old days. That's right, you all say, but revolution means bloodshed. How terrible. When the government said, line up boys and give the Germans what for, so we can pinch the German colonies and anything that's lying handy. Down with the beast of Berlin. Did anyone say it means bloodshed? You can't learn to swim without getting wet. But because a revolution might mean bloodshed, that is no reason why it should mean bloodshed. You can't be on the side of capitalists naturally. Whether you're a worker of any sort, a policeman, a soldier, a sailor, or an airman. You can't be on the side of government, which runs the country for the benefit of the capitalists. Get into the ranks of the anarchist communists right now. So, there we go. That's Motler in its own way. And the last one, I'll let people read themselves. This is a poem by Motler on his views back. I'm going to leave that up. and we're just going to have a 5-minute comfort break. Everyone can take the time. If anyone wants me to translate that into BSL, I can do. Just ask me. But that's the end of our presentation. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being here, and we'll have a discussion amongst ourselves in 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.